Hello.
Namaskaram. Good afternoon to all. My name is Indu Ponappan. I represent Raising Our Voices Foundation, abbreviated to ROV, which is a team of passionate women working for over a dozen years on gender balance, gender justice, women empowerment, and child support. And today I am delighted to be here to moderate this session with three remarkable people you see on stage,
Hello.
and each one
Hello.
of them you'll see has an individual value to add. The topic for today is raising our voices for gender
Hello.
justice. These three people who you see on stage have leveraged their talent, their skills, and the media of their strength to speak about themes that are largely ignored and questioning the logic or rather the lack of it and influencing change. So that much for the preface. Let me start with Nandini first. Nandini has chosen to write about a theme that we haven't quite seen written about, that is surviving suicide loss. Her book, Left Behind, talks about the struggles of survivors of suicide loss. Nandini, you have spoken about the shaming and blaming, the stigma, the secrecy, and so on. Have you felt that women are more impacted due to the societal norms on womanhood, motherhood, and widowhood? You have done extensive research on the topic. So, what is your thought?
Thank you, Indu, for that question. Hi, everyone. Before I respond to Indu's question, I just like to give you a little bit of the backstory so that you can place my response in perspective. I lost my husband, who was a well known urologist, to suicide about 8 years back. That was an event which changed my life upside down, inside out. But I should also confess, until I was impacted by suicide loss, suicide was something that always happened to other people, other families, not in my family. I had no connection with it, because there was so much of othering which happened. But then, of course, once it hit me, then it's always like when something really impacts us, that's when everything changes. I also realized that this was something where there was so much of stigma, shame, secrecy, and silence. And then I also felt I needed to be the change I wanted to see. And once, I think on the day the incident happened, I decided that I've got to speak up. For me, speaking up, and I'm a writer, I'm an author, there's nothing else I know other than communicating. I decided that I needed to own my narrative because otherwise, given the widespread stigma, shame, secrecy, and silence, that narrative would be hijacked by society. And I didn't want that to happen because it was about my story, my life, my power. And writing was an act of great transgression for me. It was about reclaiming my narrative. And so, coming back to your question, Indu, whether how this impacts women, uh, I was horrified to know that suicide bereavement is so different from other kinds of bereavement. You don't have the empathy, you don't have the support, especially if one is a woman. I've been talking to women who've lost spouses to suicide, women who've lost children to suicide. There's so much of blaming, shaming, judgment. You're really under the scanner, and people are out to be judge, jury, and executioner. So this had to change. I realized that they had a lot of this kind of bereavement had a lot of gendered dimensions. And also for me, I realized it was about people with a lived experience. Like I'm someone who's been directly, personally impacted by suicide loss. I'm not here today after Googling it. I haven't written the book after Googling it. course, I did a lot of research, but the primary purpose from which the book emerged was my lived experience. And I realized that people with lived experience, especially in an area which is shrouded in stigma, shame, secrecy, and silence, have a huge responsibility to reclaim the narrative, to change the narrative by challenging the narrative. So that's that's how the book got written, and that's why I'm here, to change narratives, one conversation at a time, one story at a time.
Thank you, Nandini. So, this point about women being more impacted comes from a mother being asked, didn't you see it coming? A spouse being asked, didn't you see it coming? What did you not do about it? What did you do about it? What did you not do? And asking questions on the why. They are also struggling about the why. They don't know. The survivors do not know the why. And we asking them is not going to make it any better for them. And Nandini spoke about lived experience. And we have a journalist who has seen a lot in her 30 years of journalism. And she has authored many books. And I specifically want to talk about one book, The Little Flower Girl and Others. I should say I absolutely enjoyed the book. It's a collection of stories, short stories, from people she has met during her journalist career. And every story is very short, sweet, crisp, and about real people, real life. She has divided the book into 4 sections, and 2 of these lingered with me after I read the book. One is about children, and the other about the marginalized. My question is on the latter. So, Nandini spoke about not being understood. I read this quite touching experiences you have shared from speaking to many people about homosexuals in India who lead a dual life, and you wrote about the Kuvagam festival as well. In your and that is not homosexual, transgenders too. So, in your career, these stories are from the early 2000s. So while you have been there for more years in journalism and you interact with more people, have you seen a change in India?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, definitely there is a change, I feel. Not enough. Of course, not enough. Closer. Uh, I met these people in the late 90s and early 20s. Government was pumping in a lot of money, this Gates Foundation, all that, for HIV AIDS. So that very the people who are more affected by HIV AIDS were this sex workers, transgender people, and so that is how actually I started meeting these people. In fact, it was also a learning experience for me. For example, I didn't know how a transgender person felt or a gay person felt. So I always wondered how it is. So the first time I went and met these transgender people in their organization called Sahodari. So before that, I have only seen them on the roads, extremely aggressive, begging for money. And but once inside, and when they started talking to me their story, it was a totally different, broken, highly sensitive people. They were, most of them, majority of them, maybe all of them cried. All these, they were men, and some of them dressed as women. They all cried, talking about how their childhood was. The first, it started in the family itself. Parents beat them, physically abused them. Some of them were given electric shock so that actually they would come out of this feeling. So I started asking them, what exactly is the feeling? Then they said, you will not understand. You are a woman, you feel a woman inside. But see, I am a man, but I feel like a woman inside. You will never understand how I feel, how difficult it is for me to live in this body. It is, even today, it is very difficult for me to understand how that is. But their life, somehow, I felt we have wronged them, the entire society, starting from their family, in school. School, the other children actually tease them for the way actually they walked, their preferences, and then later on the entire society itself. So the almost all of them ran away from home to their community. That is why this ghettoization happens, because that is the only place they are accepted, they are part of. And then the other things start, how they live. So then I asked, why are you so aggressive, why are you begging? They said, do you think anybody will give us a job? So one person actually was an extremely beautiful woman. She said, I went to a shop, asked for a job. The moment I opened my mouth, they said, go away, get out. Because they understood the voice is masculine. She looked, physically, she was a beautiful woman. But this is the way society actually treats them. So then what do we do? There are only two options for them, either begging or sex work. And they are exploited by the police, everybody, all the men. Today actually there was a transgender person from Manipur speaking there at the one auditorium there. So she was saying at night when they walk, they are attacked by men, police, everybody, because they know that these people are so vulnerable. So this is how actually it all started, Indu, for me.
Indu, my namesake. Nandi, do you have any experiences around this, since you have been in a lot of public art projects, Indu, and Nandini, in your research? Have you come across anything where you see this acceptance is lacking and they're still struggling, the marginalized society where it includes homosexuals and transgender people? Are they still struggling? What do you feel as a change that has happened in the past many years?
Thank you so much for. I'm very happy to be here. Um, when asked questions like this, I constantly try to think about representation. Is it right for me to answer? I'm not a transgender, and how can I answer for them? I mean, they rightfully should be here to answer these questions of the struggles and issues that they go through. As a woman, I can talk about the issues that has happened around me, to me. When I started a project called Ceciliad, it was talking about safety for women in public spaces. We were talking about, I was attacked on the street. Randomly, two boys come, spit pan on me. Why? I don't know. I kept asking, why did this just happen? I went home, cried, thought about what is going on? Why is this happening? I went around asking a lot of women around me, have any of you experienced something like this, or have you any experience? Everybody had a story to tell. And I'm sure today all of you have some stories to tell as well. Somebody looked at you differently, somebody made a comment about you. Why this constant targeting? Enough, no? Madi. I always say enough. Let's talk about it. Let's do something about it. We did this large project which is still going on. I started in 2018, where we do this public performances. We were a bunch of women. We would go, there's this place in Bangalore called Kamanali, where there is, at one point there was 37 bars in 1 kilometer stretch. They were all shady bars, dark cages where people could go drink and get out. In Bangalore, it's very expensive for women to drink. You have to go to fancy bars or pubs. So I said, let's all go to these bars and talk about this. Let's talk about what we are going through and make them understand, if possible, like this is what is happening. It's very hard for me to even navigate outside these bars. We did a lot of these multiple kind of interventions. We still do, trying to just not always look over your shoulder and just walk freely. I remember I was given a residency in Canada, and I was like, wow, this is such a nice city, but I didn't have anything to do there in terms of what project would I make, because here there's so much and I'm always fighting. there I didn't have anything as such to actually do a project. And the only thing I did, I would go to all these parks and I would sleep in the park because I didn't have to worry about sleeping in the park. Nobody's going to come and touch me. And I remember, and they were all laughing at it. I said, "This is like basic privilege, just in an open space for me to just sit, just have a nap." And I understood the importance of that when I was there. But so the fight is constantly going on. A huge change will happen if all of us, all of you together, along, we all fight at it, because otherwise it is still happening. From 10 years to now, I'm sure there are changes that have happened, but I think the change will happen if all of us come together. Yeah, that's my.
I have a follow-up question. So
Yeah.
good that you brought up Ceciliad. And I want to know, how did you conceptualize this? How did you find Cecilia as the face of the gender disruptor?
Yeah, yeah.
How was the receptiveness? And what is the impact that you created?
Yeah. So Cecilia is a project, I'll kind of explain, is a project where we talk about, like every project, there's like big, I think I saw Ilanza or some kind of a, I don't even know, like a advertisement of Basil Joseph on these posters. Every project or every thing has some actor or somebody famous. And I said, okay, I met this person called Cecilia, and I remember it was a evening, and I was walking past in Bangalore, and I see her, 78-year-old woman on a cycle with a cape, like Superwoman. Her cape is flying, she's on the cycle, and there's a dog going along with her. And I was like, I need to meet this person. I really think that is me in few years. Let me go and meet her. And I stopped her. We had a conversation. She said, I will only talk if you take a shot of brandy with me. I said, definitely. No questions asked. We had a shot of brandy. We spoke a lot about the issues that we were going through. And I said, there's this project that I want to do about safety for women in public spaces, and I want you to be a part of it. She said, will my photo come in the paper? I said, I will make sure that it does. And she's become very famous after that. It's also interesting because she's now 80. She lives in a house all by herself, and there's a lot of people trying to harm her because land sharks want her house. A single lady, no family, no children. It's very easy to take over the house. But now, because she's become popular because of the project, she always says, I have a Facebook page. So nobody actually questions her. So it's quite nice to see how she's become famous to a certain extent that nobody actually harms her. So this project has been going on since 2018. My friendship with Cecilia has been close to 10 years. I also have small matchboxes of her. So if anybody asks any of us a question, there will be a matchbox given to them. So keep your questions in mind.
Thank you, Indu. You should really look up Cecilia. It is wonderful to see those photographs, and I really love the settings and the props, and everything has a depth onto it. So, talking about feminism and feminist consciousness, Nandini, I'll come back to you. In your book, I think it was a chapter on the reality check, one of the first segments of the book, you mentioned about one of your friends telling you that being grounded in feminist consciousness is a critical part of healing. And in the later parts of the book, I read about many of your acquaintances or friends. I remember Reena, I remember Sudha and Vasanda, one daughter who lost her father to suicide, one sibling, and the other a mother. So do you think being grounded in feminist consciousness and abdication of responsibility, do you think these would have helped them heal faster, or at least there also she talks about two things, especially with suicide loss. There is a before suicide and after suicide loss stages in the life of any survivor. So considering that, do you think the consciousness about these would have helped them heal faster?
I'll speak for myself. I'll speak for my journey, and maybe then let's see if it could be applicable. So, to your question, Indu, about feminist consciousness, I'm a robust feminist, and I say that with great pride and honor. For me, I'm not one of those people who say, oh, but I'm not a feminist. Because for me, the F word is very, very powerful. It's who I am, it's an integral part of my identity. And for me, my kind of feminism is very homegrown. It grounds me, it's homegrown, it grounds me, it centers me. And one of the critical aspects of feminist consciousness, as I see it, is my refusal to be a victim. Even when this happened, it was so easy to say, poor me. And I remember my spiritual guru, on the day this incident happened, he told me, avoid the victim trap. You know, what makes you think you're so entitled that you didn't deserve this? At that point, I must today, even today, very frankly admit I wasn't very clear about what he meant, but he knew I would figure it out. So, and it's so interesting today that this session is happening on the beach, and I hear the music of the waves, because for me, this journey has been a journey navigating oceanic grief. And my book is not just all about this Rona Dona, sad, oh my God, this terrible things happening. It's for me, the event happened, I had no control over it. But where I had every choice was to choose my response. That was a refusal to be a victim, to fall into the victim trap. Yes, of course, it was very, very challenging. It's not as easy as ABC. There were ups and downs, mountains and valleys, but it was about climbing every mountain, following every rainbow. I was adrift on oceanic grief. And I remember at one point I asked my uncle, who was the inspiration behind the book, I said, will I ever reach the shore? And he said, trust me, one day you will. And the last chapter of my book is literally, I mean, I was just on the first anniversary of my loss, I was walking on the seashore in Rameshwaram, which was a very primal, non-touristy beach. And there was this fisher there on the seashore. He said, I just returned from the sea, and he had an oyster shell with him, which had 7 iridescent pearls. He said, I don't know why I want to give this to you. For me, it was like that journey was actually plumbing the depths of sorrow, really, really touching a bottomless ocean of sorrow. And when you go really rock bottom, you can't go down any further. But because you've hit rock bottom, you can, even this, when you rise, the sky is not the limit. So for me, those pearls of wisdom were literally what I found in my underwater exploration of grief. So the whole thing, what I'm trying to say is that when things happen that you didn't anticipate, that's that's beyond your control. I think it's very important for us to realize what we can control and what we have no control over. To me, much of life we have no control over, but where we have control is choosing our responses, consciously choosing responses, and that for me is the essence of feminist consciousness. It's just saying no to victimhood, because victimhood is disempowering. Victimhood is going round and round and round and just losing oneself. But feminist consciousness is looking inwards, looking within, and realizing that all the resources that we need, the infinite resources which we need, is really, really within us. It's not outside. Ironically, most of us, we look outside to circumstances, to people for support. I'm not saying there's nothing wrong in doing that, but you just need to look within, it's all there. And then being the best possible version of oneself. Feminist consciousness actually has helped me reinvent myself. Today, when I look at myself, it's like looking at Nandini 4.0, because the person I was before the tragedy, before the trauma, is no longer there. And modern psychology today corroborates this. We call it post traumatic growth. You know, we often think trauma is the end of the road. We are familiar with PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, but trauma can also be a vehicle for transformation, for growth, for going beyond oneself and discovering new versions of oneself. That for me is also the essence of feminist consciousness.
Thank you, Nandini. That was inspirational. And I clearly remember one line that you wrote, and again, the first segment of the book, where she had gone out, and correct me if I'm wrong about any incident that I'm going to quote. So she had gone out soon after her loss, and she was wearing a bright colored dress. And a close friend commented, "Oh, you're wearing a bright colored dress. How could you after a loss?" And she said, "I am not a moth, I am a butterfly." And it was quite a strong statement. Why can you go from a butterfly to a moth? Because you have suffered a loss. And let people be. Now that we are talking about choices, Shobha, let me come back to you. In your book, again in the marginalized, you've spoken about looking for foster homes for HIV infected children. And there is one other story about Rose, who is a transgender, who was, in spite of being educated in India and abroad and being a brilliant student, could not land up a job because they were transgender. So, do you remember about these two incidents, and what do you have to share about the first on the foster? It's all about choices and acceptance. So, about the foster homes and about Rose.
Yeah, this there are this AIDS orphans, they say, that is children born to parents who are AIDS and they die, and the children become orphans. They are called, we call them AIDS orphans. So there is this one doctor there in Chennai. Actually, she was the first person who started an ashram for, she called it Shes Ashram for these AIDS orphans. It started with two children. She was a doctor in the government hospital, and one orphanage brought a lot of children for testing, and they found that these two children, Krishnaveni and Ravi, both of them were HIV positive. So the orphanage didn't want them back. So these children were left in the hospital itself. So this doctor, she was a gynecologist. She felt these two children were so withdrawn, aggressive, and not at all communicative. So the doctor took these children to her place because she tried all the orphanages. Nobody wanted these children who were HIV positive. So she took them to her home, and she gave them her house as the home. So these two children were there. It started with these two, Krishnaveni and Ravi. After that, more and more children came. Then she felt they should have a proper home, not the home that she is giving. At least for some time, they should be with other parents. So she started asking many parents, "Will you take them and at least a few months so that they experience the real home?" You won't believe, only she doctor was telling me that extremely poor families, only they were willing to take these children to their place. No middle class, no upper middle class, no lower middle class, no. They were not interested. They were scared. They felt that these HIV positive children, they were all very, very small children. Some of them 1 year old, few months old, but they were so scared. They felt that their children would get HIV because they mingling with these children. This was in the early 2000. At that time, everybody knew that was not the way the virus spreads. But only these poor people, they took these children to their homes, and they were loved, they were fed, they were loved, and they played with the other children. Of course, they were playing with other children in this ashram also, but here it is a proper family. So that is the attitude of the society. That is, oh,
Thank you, Shobha. Now we are nearing the last 10 minutes of the moderated session and then it'll open for audience questions. Let me read out, Indu, from your website, with your permission. Let me read it out for the audience. Women's leisure is always confined. It is never in a public place. Nammakate is different in that sense. When you pull up the shutters, it opens out to the road. Tell us more about Nammakate, the receptiveness, and what you faced.
Hi. So one of the things I think maybe for all of us to think about is, do you see women sitting and doing nothing in public spaces? It's very hard for us to kind of see this visual imagery. I didn't want future generations to grow up not seeing women sit and do just absolutely nothing. It's actually beautiful because I see that a lot here in the beach. But in a city like Bangalore, it's very hard for women to just sit on the road and just do nothing, because most of the time you're asked to go home. You're constantly asked to be productive. You have to cook. You have to feed your children. You have to do a lot of these things. So back 5 years ago, I thought about this space called Nammakate. Nammakate in Kannada means our space. And it's a shutter shop. So once you open the shutter, it's out in the public. It's just a space for women to sit, scratch, scream, do whatever they want. A space that does not require to function in any which way. It's been the 5th year and it's actually very beautiful. We've had a lot of people be very uncomfortable with the space. A lot of men have come and said, because of you, my wife is talking back to me. I don't understand what that means. I thought she already could speak. So what is this talking back? And then we had, oh, this is anti-men establishment. There's nothing like that. It's a space just to chill. Like, there's also one unjal. There's one unjal and at the, it's also nice, like, because most of the time the swing is taken over by the children. Sometimes it's okay to take it back and we can also sit on the swings. So it's a nice space. It's still going on. Hopefully it will run for like 10-15 years. We are hoping that the government kind of takes this idea on and open many such Nammakates all across Bangalore and Karnataka, and also hopefully like other states as well, because I think it's important to make this visual memory of a city where we see women in leisure as well. So that's what the space is.
Thank you. Open spaces. Let us have more open spaces in our minds for acceptance and empathy, more open spaces in our surroundings to accept people of any kind, not just binary. And with that, I close this moderated session and open it up to the audience. You can ask your questions in English or Malayalam. ഒരാൾക്ക് മാത്രമേ മലയാളം ഫ്ലുവൻ്റ് അല്ലാതെ ഉള്ളൂ, പക്ഷേ ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് ചെയ്യാം. The floor is open for questions.
Hi. Um, uh, as you might know, as all of you might know, feminism in India is extremely problematic in the sense that it's very exclusionary. And even take this panel, right? It's all, I'm really sorry, I don't mean it, but everyone here come from a privileged background. There are no queer, trans, or indigenous women in the panel, right? What do you do as like personally, how do you make your workspaces and personal spaces more open to intersectional feminism? Or how do you change the narrative that comes about when you talk about, female spaces? Or how do you make it safe for cisgendered women to be more accepting of trans people or like queer women in general?
I can take it. Thank you so much for the question. Very important. That's what I talk about representation a lot. Nammakate as a space is for women and women identifying people and also children to come, and this space, if you have ever come to Bangalore, is right behind the Banaswadi railway station, where there's a huge section of people who are transgenders who live in the area, and they constantly frequent the space. And it's actually very beautiful because they actually help in making the space, because there's always this binary tension in that space where the men are slowly trying to take over the space, but the transgenders actually are so beautiful. They come, they sit there, and they really take over the space. They advocate what is important and what is happening. And initially, of course, it was very tough. I would be very honest. It was extremely tough for the people there because they understood binary only. And the moment the transgenders came in, it became such an inclusive space and very much celebrated. We are having, by end of February, there's this award thing that we do called the Nammakate Awards, which is being done by the transgender community in the area. Yeah, so that's how I kind of go about it. But yeah.
I'd also like to respond to your question. That's a very, very interesting question. Incidentally, my PhD is in gender studies. So I really, really get where you are coming from. Two things. When I started doing my PhD in gender studies, which was about 30 years back, gender was binary. Um, but today we've moved a long way, and gender is now a spectrum with non binary identities, with intersectionality being more a norm than an exception. So, as a feminist, I'm also very aware that the Indian feminist movement hasn't been very inclusive of identities which do not conform to the norm. But as I said, I think each of us has a responsibility to change the narrative in whatever ways we can. So, what I do is two things I do. One is that, of course, uh, I I work a lot with people with marginalized identities. In my workspace, in my day job, I work in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion with a well-known DEI consulting firm in Delhi, in Chennai. So I really, really champion the representation and inclusion of people with who are underrepresented. Like, for example, persons with disabilities, persons with neurodiversity, and a lot of my work is with persons with mental health issues, people impacted by suicide loss. The reason I say this is that I think we need to decenter what is considered normalized experiences by society at large. You know, how do we move people on the margin? What is the center? And I think it's about, you know, widening your ambit, your bandwidth, so that more and more people are enabled to find their centers and not be on the periphery. One of the ways I do it is my role as an ally. In fact, my first book was co-written with A. Revati, who's a well-known self-identified trans woman and a trans activist. And that book was, I think, last month republished by Tilted Access Press. It's a translation which I've done. So allyship, you know, we can't, I completely agree with Indu in that. You can't co-opt people's narratives, especially if you do not have the lived experience. But where what you can certainly do is to show up as an authentic ally. And that's how you start changing the narrative, you know, in whatever ways you can. Of course, nothing changes overnight, but I think it's about having that very inclusive feminist sensitivity and sensibility. And by the way, I just wanted to let you know, privilege, yes, we are all privileged, but privilege is not a bad word. It's what you do with privilege that is more important. But thank you for that lovely question.
Interesting to hear fair-skinned, well-fed women discussing very serious matters regarding the mainstream women. Mainstream women in India are SC, ST, OBC, and minority women. They form 85% of this population. And the elite, the creamy section of the women, that is upper caste. I don't say upper caste, migrant caste. Migrant caste women, like migrant caste men, see, they are trying to monopolize, dictate things, and I don't know, they are trying to be their protectors, saviors. You cannot be their saviors. They can come up by their own and you need not be their saviors. Nobody can save them. They themselves come up. Just give them space. Don't bring an obstacle before them. Whenever the women representation in different posts are concerned, only the well-fed upper caste, migrant caste women are considered. Brahmins and Banyas and other women. Why it's so? When you say women, like men are also like different communities, different communities. Brahmin, Paraya, Pulaya, tribe, Adivasi women, they are also women. They form the majority of this population. And still they are underrepresented, they are never there. So, after all, we claim that we are a democratic country. Of course, we are a politically democratic country, but this democracy is not being implemented in any sphere. For example, 33% of women representation in legislature when it came to for the discussion, all the political parties headed by the migrant caste, they were supported. But nobody said that it should be on caste basis. When you say 33% representation of women, that will come only for the migrant caste, Brahmins and other upper caste women. That will never touch the ground level. So, this in India, this Brahminical India, women are not considered, actually women are not considered human beings. Even Brahmin women are not Brahmins, they are Shudras. I hope you think. So women are inferior because by the entry of the migrant Aryans, this society became patriarchal. Before that it was matriarchal. All the values of these Brahminical values are anti-woman, anti-Dalit and anti-OBC. And all the other transcendent everything is there. So unless we realize these anti-human Brahminical values, we cannot fight this system. So do you have any idea about it and how to combat it?
So, we are not clear about your question. Could you repeat your question, please? Just the question, just the question.
The unrepresented mainstream majority of the women in India, they are nowhere in any form of power, not in any moment, not in governance, not in media, not in the economic sector, nowhere there. But all the women from the elite, the Brahminical section, the migrant caste women, are all dictating and defining everything. And how dare you to do it? Why don't you give it up? Why don't you give them the proper share?
I will just respond very quickly to your question, sir. What was your name? Your name, your Tanushree, I think she raised the issue of intersectionality. So I think there are lots of variables which intersect and lead to inequities. So caste is just one of the variables. So there are so many different variables, and when they intersect, we find things which are very, very inequitable. My answer, a short answer to your question would be, we need to address systemic inequalities. These are all part of a social system. You know, very often we tend to equate it with saying that men are perpetrators. I think we need to go beyond that, or a certain caste is responsible for all this. And look at how it's all part of a system. So systemic change, addressing systemic change doesn't happen overnight. And that's where we need allyship. We need a convergence of diverse stakeholders coming together, working towards a common cause. It takes time, but it is possible. I have no magic formula, no magic wand, but it requires massive convergence of diverse stakeholders with that sensitivity and sensibility. And then perhaps we can witness change happening. In fact, all what we've been talking today, whether it's Indu's Namakate or Shobha's the narratives or my own narratives, it's about addressing systemic changes, systemic inequalities, which are very, very deeply entrenched.
Hello, good evening. I'm Anil Pillai from a middle class family, and I want to know whether there is feminism in, sorry, rather consciousness. In consciousness, there is different feminism or just humanistic.
I get heard. I hear this so very often. Many. I've heard many people say that feminism is humanism, undoubtedly. So while consciousness is very gender inclusive, consciousness has no gender.
So it
But
is equal. So it is equal.
yes, of course. In that sense, it's inclusive. I'm not saying it is equal. It is inclusive. But here, when I say feminist consciousness, what I mean is that advocating for myself, standing up for myself, taking responsibility for my life, having agency, having the ability to make those informed choices, not default choices. You know, do I have the clarity before I make a choice? That is agency, autonomy. My conception that I'm an independent person, yet I'm also interdependent. Accountability. Do I take accountability for my life? Do I self audit? Do I audit my life? These, for me, are part of feminist consciousness. But consciousness is gender inclusive. But here, of course, I'm talking particularly about feminist consciousness, which is what Indu pulled out from my book.
What I feel is there is no separate consciousness for female or male. Both are same.
I'm really not getting into that man woman divide at all, sir, because I think those binary categories itself is so very limiting. Yeah.
That again, sorry, I'm taking little bit. Hello, sorry, I'm taking little time because my mother also attempted suicide. That's why. So, what I feel is that depends on class also. Highly educated and lower educated and
Uh,
poor and rich. That also comes into play.
Sir, I would just want to reiterate a point here. As far as suicide loss is concerned, it's a great leveler. If there is one leveler in the world, let me tell you, it's suicide loss. The last 8 years, I've been researching extensively on this. I run a postvention, a post bereavement support group for rural women impacted by suicide loss in Tamil Nadu, in Madurai, in 3 blocks in the district, in Madurai district. The stories I hear from those women are no different from my stories. Here I am, a highly educated, what some of you would call a woman with privilege. When I sit with those women, it's their stories are my story is their stories. So where is the question of privilege? Where is the question of anything else coming in? If there is one great leveler in the world, and it's not me alone who's saying it, I've been talking to several women impacted by suicide loss across the world, and the issues are so similar, the challenges are so similar, the attitude of society is so similar. Everyone is so quick to be judge and jury, which is why for me my feminist consciousness is so very important, because it's so easy to be the victim when everyone around you is, feeding that victim narrative. That requires courage, that requires conviction, and we can't do it alone. We would need the support, we would need allyship from everyone in society, as do people navigating other challenges. Nobody can bring change individually by themselves. You can be a catalyst, but for the movement to be propelled to go forward, it needs to be a collective responsibility as well. Okay.
Before winding up the session, we can have one more question. We can have one more last question.
My apologies, my question is again for Nandini ma'am only, because it's about suicide. You said you wrote the book. At what stage of your grief did you decide to write the book? And at the end of it, was it a kind of catharsis for you that you wrote the book and published it?
Thank you for that very, very insightful question. Um, this is just one of the multiple challenges, the multiple curveballs life has thrown at me. But if I were to rank it on a scale of 1 to 10, this will go beyond 10. So ever since I've been 5 years old, I've been writing. So writing comes very, very naturally to me. There's no other way I express myself better than through writing. I write prose, poetry, fiction, and non-fiction. So on the day of the tragedy, my dad's brother, who is a parent figure to me, I've been very close to him right from the time I was born. When he spoke to me, he lives in the US. He said, I think there's a book out there. You need to write this story because there are lots of people who I'm sure have gone through something similar, but do not know whom to turn to, would not know how to deal with it. So there is a story out there. He said, I'm sure you will not write, you may not be able to write right away, but whenever you are ready, you must do it. So he sowed the seeds of that book the day after the tragedy. But writing the book was easier said than done. In the first year, whenever I would sit down to write, I would dissolve into tears. Tears would splatter my keyboard. And I'd say, no, I can't write. And I would tell him, I'm not going to write. He said, no, one day you will. But what I did was I journaled right from the first day of the tragedy. I've still got that journal. I journal. And journaling was very therapeutic for me. It was very healing. And much later, when I look back, that journal was the first part of my book. So, but the first year I spent reading about it. Every book on suicidology in the world I've read inside out, upside down, highlighted, underlined. You know, someone could award a PhD in suicidology for me because it was to make meaning of what I was going through. So the first year was actually in very deep research. And then I visited my uncle in the US the next year. That was a beautiful experience where we sat and talked and talked and talked. And even then I said, I don't think I'm going to write because I just felt, I told him that, oh, that gift has also gone with Murli, my husband. He said, no, he's left that gift with you. So actually we sat down and we chapterized the book. You know, he said, what do you want to write? I said, first chapter, I'll do this, write this. He actually took out note cards and chapterized the book for me. And we were just talking and, you know, left behind. I just used the word left behind. He said, that's the title of the book. So the day I returned from the US, I started writing. So it was a very challenging book to write. It took me 2 years to write the book. And there were times when the book would just stop. It would not write. I couldn't write because then it would be that I was addressing issues. But you're right, writing the book was deeply healing, transformative. It was a very joyful experience, you know, of just me and the screen. And also, as a writer, I'm very good at transitions. But what I found that was my writing would just be hanging in like islands. So I would say my uncle was my editor, my therapist, my coach, and he would thread it together. So the book took 2 years to write, and incidentally, the last chapter of the book, the last line of the book was monumental sorrows can be left behind, one story at a time. I wrote the last line of the book on my husband's third death anniversary. I didn't intend to, and the last chapter was, I just felt I was downloading information. So the whole exercise of writing the book was deeply healing, deeply transformative. And that's, I think, one of the best gifts this experience has given me. And thank you for asking that question.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the
Thank you, ma'am.
panelists.
Our time is up. We are concluding the session.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah. So,
No, this is just a word of appreciation. I'm Anjali, and I must appreciate and thank ROV Foundation for bringing such wonderful women together. I must say your discussions were very inspiring and insightful, the word you used. And I also wanted to ask the principal administrator, as as the administrator of ROV, have you faced any challenges in bringing about gender imbalance?
we will talk about it offline because they have called the timeout. We'll definitely talk about it offline. You have a big batch of
Okay,
ROVians
I'll
all
pass it on.
around you. Thank you very much for being an engaged audience, and thank you, panelists, for having accepted our invite. Thank you very much.